Thank you all so much for being here. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Grace Cowan, and I'm a National Officer of the Stop the War Coalition. Could you all please try and keep yourself muted? Thank you. The drive to all-out war with Iran might have dropped out of the headlines, but the West, as we know, continues to heighten tensions under the radar. And this is a very timely and important meeting, so I'm very pleased to be here with you all this evening. Britain, France, and Germany recently announced their intentions to reimpose sanctions on Iran for not complying with the requirements of a deal which Trump unilaterally destroyed several years ago. Of course, we also know that Israel didn't face any consequences for its illegal aggression against Iran earlier this year, which killed hundreds of civilians. And the same states which are sanctioning Iran for its civilian nuclear program refuse to even acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapons. They have shown no interest in disarming a nuclear state which has been committing genocide for almost 2 years and is clearly determined to plunge the whole entire region into a state of permanent war. In this context, it's crucial for us to emphasize that war with Iran is not in our interests. It's not even in the interests of the British, American, or European elites. It's Israel, and Israel alone, that is threatened by Iran. Such a genocidal rogue state cannot tolerate, however slight that may be. Iran is only a threat to us in Britain and the United States, therefore, if we unthinkingly accept that Israel's foes are our foes, and if we reflexively accept we must fuel and fight Israel's wars on its behalf. We can't accept either of those things. Putting Israel's interests at the center of our foreign policies is a threat not just to the peoples of the entire region, but to our security here at home. Our conversation tonight will point to an alternative vision, highlighting how Britain and its European partners can play a more constructive role instead of partaking in the drive to war. And for that discussion, we are delighted to be joined again by Trita Parsi, a leading expert on relations between Iran and the United States, and the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is a fantastic foreign policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. Trita will be in conversation with Steve Bell, one of the Stop the War Coalition national officers. Steve is going to do a Q&A with Trita, and then we will hopefully have some time to take some questions from you. So I would please ask if you could send those questions in the chat directly to me, that I can pass them on to Steve, and so that he can discuss your points with Trita too. But that's quite enough for me. I'll hand over to Steve now. Steve Bell, over to you.
Thanks, Grace. Trita, in your excellent book, Losing an Enemy, you explain the evolution of US policy towards the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. You highlight the significant change in US policy brought about by Obama. He basically said there really are only two alternatives here. Either the issue of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon is resolved diplomatically through a negotiation, or it's resolved through force, through war. Those are the options, so said Obama. Now, Obama opted for a negotiated solution and so conceded the right of Iran to enrich its own uranium. Trump is now insisting that Iran must not be able to enrich its own uranium. Are we in a position when it is inevitable that Trump will attempt to finally resolve the issue through war, as even the additional sanctions threatening Iran will not bring a change of position?
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for being here today and organizing this. I really appreciate it. We are in a situation right now in which, and this may sound a bit odd since I've been such a strong proponent of diplomacy, but under the current circumstances, I'm leaning towards thinking that diplomacy may actually be a bit dangerous. And hear me out. Right now, you're in a situation in which the two sides are just simply too far away from each other. Trump is either thinking that he's already resolved the issue and he doesn't want to have to deal with it and he's happy that it's not on his desk any longer, or he is oscillating into the view that, he is in such a strong position so that the Iranians absolutely just simply have to capitulate. And we can see that over the course of the last couple of months, his position has hardened. They started off diplomacy, not insisting on zero enrichment. Now he insists on zero enrichment, complete dismantlement, no missile program, nothing essentially. He just wants to completely disarm any deterrence the Iranians could have. And on the other hand, the Iranians are not budging an inch on the issue of enrichment, to a large part, I think, because they recognize that they are under threat. And that if they were to give in on that issue, immediately afterwards, the US would shift its focus to missiles and other things. So as a result, compromising on enrichment does not end the conflict. It just shifts it towards a different focus of the conflict, going from nuclear to missiles to Iranian support for various groups in the region. If you, under normal circumstances, started negotiations under these, the two sides would feel each other out. Over time, perhaps there would be a softening on both sides and there would be a movement towards compromise, but it would require a significant amount of time. Time is exactly what Trump does not like to spend. He's impatient, and if you have talks right now under the current circumstances, I fear that they would lead to a quick failure because of the significant distance between the two sides. And once the talks have failed, the pressure on Trump from the Israelis and others will become overwhelmingly saying, you have to take military action. So until there is a stronger basis for negotiations, reaching some sort of a compromise with some level of willingness on both sides, I fear that given the circumstances of the very low patience of Trump, the massive pressure from the Israelis, that would only lead to a scenario in which we would actually get to a war faster than we might otherwise do. I think there's going to have to take some significant effort to make Trump realize that he needs to have a much, much more realistic position on this issue. And I think that has to happen before there is negotiations. Otherwise, we're just going to see them tripling down on their positions, digging themselves deeper into this hole. So I want to emphasize, this is not an argument against diplomacy. It's an argument to say we have to do a little bit more preparatory work before diplomacy can be given a fair chance.
I'd like to draw out from your response a clearer understanding of what the forces are inside the United States which are pushing Trump towards war, because we know that, as you say, initially his position was for negotiations and that enrichment was not a red line for him. Then the whole administration seemed to have shifted its position, as you say, hardened considerably. So can you give us some sense of what the domestic forces are that are propelling his position?
So first of all, I think that's a very important question, but I want to emphasize, I don't think it is primarily a domestic constituency that has pushed him in the position, in the direction he's gone, but it's rather pressure from the Israelis. Of course, there are elements in the United States as well that may align themselves with the Israelis or against the Israelis, and they do matter too. The restrainer realism camp is the camp that thought that this should be negotiated. There's absolutely no value of going to war with Iran. The Middle East is not that important. We should get out of these different wars in the region. And who also believe that war would be a very, very bad thing, that would potentially be a long-term war rather than just a quick military action. You do have very powerful, more traditional or neoconservative Republicans in the administration, such as Marco Rubio, and a very, very strong element among some of the donors of Trump who are very hawkish on this issue, who bankrolled Mike Pompeo last time Trump was president, who bankrolled John Bolton last time Trump was president, and they're still there. They're still pushing very hard. And they just have different elements that they're pushing for right now, individuals, compared to the previous administration. Amongst the MAGA base, this was not popular, but it was also not seen as particularly problematic because of the fact that the US's involvement was essentially a one-off, an attack on Fordo and some of these other facilities, and it ended rather quickly. And the Iranian response was telegraphed, choreographed, so it never led to the larger war. Had it led to the larger war, and had there been Americans coming home in coffins, I think the split within the Republican base between the MAGA and the more traditional would have become much, much deeper. It was already a very, very intense fight between the two sides. But part of the reason why the MAGA didn't make too big of a fuss about it was because at the end of the day, it didn't become the large war that they really dreaded and deeply opposed. That's not to say that they were excited about these attacks, but the larger consequence that they feared never materialized. I think it would be a huge mistake for the Trump administration. I don't think they're making this mistake, thinking that, they got away with it, so they actually could go ahead and do this every once in a while and it will be fine. Their base will be okay. I think they understand very well that this actually would have created a significantly different political response had it gone on. That's not going to stop the Israelis, though. The Israelis are going to push for more US involvement. I believe the Israelis will start a war relatively soon. Again, and they will do everything they can, of course, to get the US into that war.
The nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA as we call it, was agreed between Iran and 6 other governments: China, France, Germany, Russia, UK, and US in July 2015. It lifted UN sanctions on Iran, but did not lift the unilateral sanctions of the US. Despite that limitation, the agreement regulated Iran's nuclear development, allowing it sovereignty over its own peaceful development. In return, Iran received the benefits of having some sanctions relieved, which led to a sustained increase in economic growth in Iran. Until Trump withdrew the US from the JCPOA and imposes a new round of US sanctions, ending that growth in the economy. During this time, the E3 governments, Britain, France, and Germany, refused to confront the US government's breach of the agreement. Indeed, they accepted US sanctions and allowed their economies to be disengaged from Iran, so that in 2024, Europe-Iran trade is only a fifth of what it was in 2017, the last full year of the agreement. Now, in August, the E3 governments have claimed that Iran is in breach of the JCPOA and that UN sanctions on Iran will be reimposed by the end of September. What is your analysis of the E3 move?
I think this was a very unfortunate decision by the E3. I think the E3 know very well that this is putting us much closer towards a larger military confrontation. I think they know very well that the Rubio faction in the administration is going to take advantage of it in order to push for US involvement in the war. I think the E3 understands very well that this will be functioning as a lubricant for the Israelis to start their next attack. I think the Israelis will do it anyways, but this will give them an air of legitimacy because of the decision by the E3 on this issue. And particularly in the manner that this was done. The public demands from the EU, which on the surface sound quite reasonable. The Iranians should open up for more collaboration with the IAEA, restart negotiations, etc. On the surface, it makes a lot of sense. But when you scratch the surface, you realize that these are much more complicated demands, particularly once they made public, because the Iranians were just bombed. If the whereabouts of the 60% enriched uranium is completely revealed, what is the guarantee that they will not be bombed again? Because either the US or the Israelis will do everything they can to destroy the 60% stockpile of enriched uranium. So, that all of those demands came without any accompanying demands that there shouldn't be any more military action. And I think this raises the question, why did the Europeans do it? Mindful of the fact that it is really difficult. And I'm saying this having had extensive conversations with many of their diplomats, in which none of the conversations really led to a scenario in which with high confidence one could say that this will lead to a better outcome, that this will lead to a diplomatic outcome. I think the answer lies not in Iran and not in the nuclear issue, but rather in Ukraine and the significant shifts that have taken place in Europe over the course of the last couple of years. I think it's important to remember that in 2003, when the E3 constellation was first created, because this is not something that has existed forever, this is something that was done in reaction to the United States invading Iraq illegally. And the Europeans were very worried that the United States would go on and invade Iran afterwards. And they initiated this diplomatic effort to prevent that war. So the E3 constellation was created to prevent war 20 years ago. And it succeeded because they made a deal with the Iranians in which the Iranians halted enrichment voluntarily. And as a result, they really took away the most potent pretext the Bush administration could have used to invade the country. And I think since then, there is a bit of a belief that the Europeans or the E3 are constantly motivated by a desire to prevent war. I think that impression may have to be reassessed under the current circumstances. And I'll do my best to explain why and back it up. After 2022, when the Russians illegally invaded Ukraine, Europe's dependence on the United States became even more clear. It was already clear for some time, and the Europeans had done very little to have any strategic autonomy. And the war also led to a scenario in which the Europeans made themselves far more dependent on the United States than they were before, despite the fact that they knew that there was a considerable likelihood that Trump would come back to office, and that Trump's perspective on Russia and Ukraine was dramatically different from that of the Biden administration. Nevertheless, the Europeans put all of their eggs in the American basket. Now they're faced with a scenario in which Iran simply is not that important to the Europeans any longer. There is no trade between Europe and Iran. Europe has abided by all of the American sanctions. It's not like 10 years ago or 15 years ago when there were some economic resistance to just having this naked escalation between the two sides. Because the Italians, the Spanish still imported 10% of their oil from Iran. None of that is the case any longer. On top of that, the Iranians supported Russia in Ukraine. So for the first time, Iran was actually actively doing something that the Europeans viewed as a significant threat. In fact, many Europeans or European leaders view Russia as an existential threat, not just as a threat. Whether that's right or wrong is a different discussion. And within the Trump administration, then you have two constellations. The Rubio faction that is much more sympathetic to Europe on Ukraine and Russia, and the restrainers and Trump himself, who seems to be of a different orientation on Ukraine. It seems to me that some sort of a bargain was made here, in which the Europeans are helpful to Rubio on an issue that is important to him, which is Iran, in return of hoping that this will help soothe the unprecedented tensions in the transatlantic relationship over the issue of Russia and Ukraine. Already in April of this year, Rubio was on record demanding that the Europeans have to trigger snapback. And that's before the war, that's before all of these different things. So I think what you have seen here is that the Europeans have essentially gone along with an escalation with Iran that likely will lead to war. Or will facilitate the gravitation towards war, knowing very well that that is the case, but accepting that in the hope that this will make the United States more amenable on Ukraine and Russia, which is far more important to the Europeans than Iran is. And to just add, I think, some very decisive evidence in this, keep in mind what the German chancellor said after the Israelis bombed Iran. This is, again, remembering that the E3 was created to prevent this, but instead of criticizing it, instead of condemning it, Merz said that Israel is doing Europe's dirty work for it. So we're talking about a scenario in which is not just an opposition to the Israelis taking military action, criticizing it, it's a full endorsement of Israel starting a war. So given that, I just find it difficult. I think it's a little bit of pathological of continuing to presume or give the benefit of the doubt that what the Europeans are doing is in the service of preventing war, when the German chancellor actually endorsed Israel taking illegal military action. It's not just an act of aggression, it's also an act of aggression against nuclear facilities, which is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. And you may all remember that the Europeans rightfully condemned Russia when Russia took military action against Ukrainian nuclear facilities. So the double standards here are, don't need to be described in any greater detail.
Yes, I agreed. And let's not forget that Starmer and Macron were also immediately out of the blocks to support the June war on Iran by Israel. As you say, there is a connection to the developments in the Ukraine. The European governments generally are folding to the demands of the United States for massive rearmament, which will cripple the welfare states across Europe. And this loss of relative autonomy by the European governments is clearly very significant. Is then the E3 simply acting as Trump's proxy in this, i.e. accelerating matters? And is this the end of the E3 in any sort of diplomatic role vis-a-vis Iran?
On the first part, yes, this is something that, as I mentioned, is moving in the wrong direction. It's a bit of a proxy. Well, I mean, I think the European calculation, as I said, is they give Rubio and that faction something that is very valuable to it on Iran in hope that they will push Trump further on Russia in a direction that is acceptable to the Europeans. And keep in mind, Rubio's own position on Ukraine is much closer to Biden's and the Europeans than it is to Trump's, based on everything he said before he became Secretary of State. Now, of course, he's done a very, very disciplined job of only channeling Trump officially. But I don't think that a lot of his previous views have just completely evaporated. After this, it's very difficult to see the Europeans having any role whatsoever, because once the JCPOA is completely destroyed, which this will do, then the Europeans will have to find some sort of a entry point into future negotiations. I think the Europeans may have already calculated that their role is gone. And as a result, they'll use the last leverage they have on this to get something that is of value to them on Ukraine, rather than to get something that is of value of them to Iran, given the fact that Iran is simply not that important to the Europeans at this point.
One of the problems with the E3 position is, as you indicated, that it creates additional excuses for a war upon Iran. In particular, I can see that there's three additional areas. Firstly, the refusal to allow Iran to enrich uranium. Secondly, the block on any assistance to Iran's missile program. And thirdly, the reimposition of an arms embargo, which was lifted under the JCPOA in 2020. Now, those seeking war, whether it's Israel or sections of the ruling circles in the United States, now have three additional areas in which to find a cause for war. Do you agree that the danger of the E3 position is just not the sanctions, but it also raises the risk of war, and this time in the name of defending UN sanctions?
I think it does, because again, it expands, as you pointed out correctly, the various grounds for what they will argue for. So even if Trump says Iran's nuclear program is obliterated and as a result should be a non-risk at this point, no pretext to go to war if they don't have it. Well, the Europeans are now adding missiles and other things as legitimate endorsed pretexts to be able to escalate this towards kinetic action. And I don't think this is a coincidence. I don't think they're unaware of what they're doing on these issues. I just think, and I'll be frank, I don't think they're doing this out of some sort of a malice. I think they're doing this out of the fact that the geopolitical situation has changed dramatically. They have played their cards horrifically, and just made themselves so much more dependent on the United States. So they're asking themselves, how can they appease the US further in hopes of getting something on Ukraine, which is more important to Europe? I don't think Europe needed to be in this situation. Had it played its cards very differently from quite some time and actually taken strategic autonomy more seriously, I think we would be in a very different situation. I also think that we probably would not have had a war in Ukraine in the first place. But here we are, and given those circumstances, this is the direction I think they're going, not out of malice or a desire. They're not all turned into neoconservatives, but their calculations have fundamentally changed.
This week, the well-respected medical journal, The Lancet, published new research on the impact of Western unilateral sanctions. These have led to 38 million deaths since 1970, according to this research. In Western media, sanctions are presented as an alternative to war, with politicians insisting that sanctions are targeted, smart, and only aimed at the regime. Yet the actual experience of these are as brutal instruments of siege against the civilian population, as the Lancet has registered. Would you give some idea of the impact of sanctions upon Iranian society and the likely impact of those being envisaged by the E3 governments?
Thank you. I had not seen that article. Those are terrifying numbers, but they frankly do make sense. One thing we oftentimes forget, that we have an entire body of international law, IHL, International Humanitarian Law, that regulates how you conduct war. I'm not saying it's followed to the degree it should be or that we would want it to be, but there is a tremendous amount of rules and laws on how warfare is legitimate or illegitimate. So, for instance, bombing civilian infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc., is actually not permissible. We have nothing when it comes to economic warfare and sanctions. So you have a completely blanket punishment against society, and all studies show that the weakest elements in society are the ones that suffer the most when sanctions are imposed, particularly embargo-style sanctions, financial sanctions, things that just hit the society in a very blanket way. And as a result, the government is oftentimes in the best position to protect and insulate itself from the consequences of sanctions, whereas society is not. So under these circumstances, we have seen it over and over and over again, that civil society, the civilian population suffer tremendously, strengthens the governments. Oftentimes, these are autocratic governments, which end up becoming more repressive and at times also more adventurous in their foreign policy. In the case of Iran, we've seen clear evidence of this. We have seen how, at the end of the day, the sanctions have led to a dramatic weakening of civil society. One study that came out in 2019 showed, or 2020, showed that Iran's middle class shrunk with 1 entire third, 15 million people went from the middle class into the poorer class, and a large number of people went into straight poverty as a result of these sanctions. It showed how the sanctions wiped out private companies, whereas companies that had the support of the state or were in the circle of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, actually took up all of those previous contracts and became much stronger. Same circumstance that we have seen in many, many other countries. So as much as there is a false belief, because in the immediate tactical situation that politicians find themselves in, Oftentimes, the only options that are being presented are sanctions and war. And in that very limited context, it looks as if sanctions are an alternative to war. But scientific studies have shown that the imposition of sanctions actually increases the likelihood of war. Because what it does is that it sets you off on an escalatory ladder. The other side responds, you impose more sanctions, they respond, and eventually you run out of things to sanction, and then you're then at the doorstep of taking military action. A statistical analysis have shown that once you go down the sanctions path, you actually increase the likelihood of military action. So even though tactically, in a limited sense, particularly mindful of the fact that the politicians have failed to expand their options, we have to ask ourselves, why is the option war or sanctions? Why isn't it war, sanctions, diplomacy, and 5 other things? That's the failure of the politicians. And once they have failed and it's only these 2 options, then it does appear as if sanctions is the alternative to war, but it actually increases the likelihood of war.
Yes, I'm sure many of us recall Marilyn Albright's famous statement about the loss of 500,000 Iraqi children. She said it was a price worth paying. What is not so well known is that much of that was a result of sanctions preventing diphtheria tablets being exported to Iraq because they were, quote, a dual-use chemical, i.e. they thought that Saddam was going to turn them into chemical weapons. So clearly, much of the impact upon Iranian society has been completely perverse in comparison to what the stated goal was. As you've indicated, there's been a huge rise in poverty, and also I understand that there's been an impact on family life in terms of people being, women being forced to bear the burden of a weakening of social services, young people making decisions to marry a later date or not to have children in order to deal with the impact upon their reduced finances. Do you think that this is the general problem now across Iranian society, that sanctions have made, as you indicated, a certain breakdown, but that it's affecting the complete fabric, including of family life?
Yes, absolutely. Because what sanctions does over time is that it really destroys the fabric of society. There was an internal State Department study, I think it was from 2004 or 2005, in which the State Department was tasked with figuring out why is it so difficult to govern Iraq. And one of the chapters was on the impact of sanctions. And it concluded that sanctions had significantly contributed to the difficulty of governing Iraq because of the manner that it had destroyed so much of social fabric in Iraq. So for instance, you had a scenario in which the economy had been shrunk, I think, to $16 billion as a result of this oil for food program, etc. And under those circumstances, suddenly Iraqi families did not have any incentives to send girls to schools. Because what was the point of educating them, teaching them how to read and write when there was absolutely no future? And they shouldn't be competing with the men in the work market because there were so little work and job opportunities available. So you saw an increase in female illiteracy in Iraq as a result of the sanctions. And incidentally, just as part of the context, Iraq has been one of the most literate Arab countries. Prior to the war, Iraq constituted for about 50% of all books published in the Arabic language. That's 1 out of 22 Arabic-speaking countries, accounted for 50% of it. So it's always been a very strong society in terms of learning, science, etc. But now you instead had female illiteracy growing as a result of the sanctions. And you tell me, what is the likelihood of having a successful governance, let alone democracy, in a society in which you've actually increased the illiteracy of one of the genders? So these are the many, many silent invisible victims of these long-standing sanctions policies. We've seen the same, not necessarily the same numbers, but the early stages of that in Iran as well. And I think it has also hardened the attitudes of the public. A couple of years ago, because of the manner in which Mahsa Amini was killed by the Iranian police in custody over her failure, according to them, to wear the hijab in a proper way, etc. There was so much anger in society against the government for what he had done. So you could see a spike in support for sanctions. You saw that as well in 2009 after cheating in the elections then. But what you see within a year and a half, 2 years, is that those attitudes change. Not because they've forgiven the government, not because they're not angry, but because it becomes so clear to the population that they are the main victims of the very sanctions that they were hoping would weaken the government. And I think we're in that situation even worse now, because not only did the sanctions make the lives of ordinary Iranians horrible, but now you also saw that in the midst of negotiations, at a moment when the Iranians were showing flexibility in a manner that they had not done ever before, that's the moment the Israelis decided to bomb the country.
The other signatories to the JCPOA, China and Russia, have opposed the E3 move. In a joint letter to the UN Security Council, the foreign ministers from China, Russia, and Iran highlight the failure of the E3 governments to uphold their commitments to the agreement. They say that the E3 move is, quote, legally and procedurally flawed, which they then go on to strengthen by highlighting a key principle of international law endorsed by the International Court of Justice that, quote, says, a party which disowns or does not fulfill its own obligations cannot be recognized as retaining the rights which it claims to derive from the relationship. In other words, as the US and E3 are both in breach, then for the other signatories, China, Iran, and Russia, they will not accept the legality of reimposition of UN sanctions. Do you agree? And what follows from this in terms of avoidance or resilience strategies by Iran?
So this is an argument that essentially says that Europe no longer has standing to be able to invoke snapback. And on top of the reasons why it doesn't have standing is because they endorsed the military action and they're now calling for zero enrichment, which completely contradicts the very fundamentals of the JCPOA. The JCPOA said that this would happen within the framework of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as a result, enrichment was accepted, but it had to be constrained. Now the European position essentially is an endorsement of zero enrichment, which then just completely contradicts the very basis of the JCPOA. This is an argument that has some legal value. In practicality, however, what it will do is very little in sense of stopping this because, the move has already occurred. Snapback will most likely happen. The sanctions will most likely come back into place. However, here is where the impact will be. With Russia and China saying this is illegitimate, that means that you have a scenario in which these sanctions no longer have the full force that they would have had if you had a united P5. And as a result, for instance, the Russians are likely going to completely ignore it. The Chinese will likely ignore key parts of it. And you will not have the same type of a scenario you had in 2010, in which these sanctions first were imposed on Iran and Russia and China were on board. They were also limiting their interaction and trade and other things with Iranians in compliance with those sanctions. We're not going to see that, at least not anywhere near to the same level as it was before. Whether that will lead to other countries also feeling that they are free to disregard this because the legality of it is under question remains to be seen. India might. But even if that were to happen, it doesn't mean that this is not going to be escalatory. It does not mean that this may not be used to further get us closer to war. What it does mean, however, is that the authority of the Security Council, the strength of international law will be weakened It already has, of course, been significantly weakened. All of these countries that have completely ignored the ruling of the ICJ, which said that there is a likely genocide taking place in Gaza. And as a result, already then they had the obligation to act to prevent that genocide. Almost none of them have. So we've already seen a tremendous weakening of international law and institutions, and this will just move it further in that direction.
As a result of the June war, the Israeli-US war upon Iran, Iran's relations with the International Atomic Energy Agency broke down. Iran has refused to allow IAEA inspectors access to the sites bombed by Israel and the US. Currently, there are negotiations underway in Cairo, which appear to have reached a very conditional and fragile understanding on a revival of inspections. Can you explain why there has been this breakdown of relations? What are the concerns of Iran in this?
So part of the reason why this is now such a tense relationship between the IAEA and Iran is because, first of all, the head of the IAEA, Grossi, did not condemn the attacks on Iran. To the best of my knowledge, he condemned the Russian attacks on Ukrainian facilities. Secondly, the Iranians believe that they have evidence. I've not seen it, but they believe that the Israelis got the names and whereabouts of some of the Iranian scientists who the Israelis killed, together with their families, and these are all civilians, that they got it from the IAEA. That the IAEA has shared a lot of sensitive information that the Iranians provided the IAEA as part of an effort to be transparent to the very same country that bombed Iran without the IAEA condemning it. So this isn't just really hardened the mood in Tehran in terms of any collaboration with the IAEA. And despite the fact that an agreement has been signed, there's still some disputes over exactly how it will be implemented. And there are strong forces in Iran that don't want to see any agreement at all at this point, because they believe this is just a different mode for Western countries to be able to corner Iran and eventually take advantage of some of that information to attack it. And without a doubt, a lot of the intelligence that exists on the Iranian nuclear program over the course of the last couple of years came from the IAEA. It's legitimate for them, of course, to share that. I mean, we see that in the reports, etc. But there is an argument in Iran that increased transparency was actually abused in order to attack the country instead. On top of that, it goes back to what I said earlier on. The Iranians say that 60% enriched uranium is under the rubble. The Israelis believe that they know where it is, etc. I've spoken to Europeans who believe that they know where it is. But let's say that it's revealed exactly where it is as a result of IAEA inspections. That will dramatically increase the likelihood that the US and Israel will attack again. Because if the stockpile exists, if it can be salvaged, then it needs to be destroyed. So why would the Iranians collaborate with that? That is the question that is asked in Tehran. Moreover, let's say that the IAEA goes in and they manage to locate where half of it is, but they can't locate the rest of it. Then that's going to raise a bunch of other questions. Where is the rest of it? Did the Iranians hide it? And then you're going to be in the same dance in which constantly the Iranians have to prove a negative. This is from their perspective. And this is why you're seeing such a hardening of the mood. Now, if the IAEA was seen as an objective actor here who had condemned what the Israelis did, there was no credible evidence that they had collaborated, etc. I'm not saying the Iranians' accusations are true. I'm trying to explain how I think they see it. Under those circumstances, perhaps this would have evolved very differently. But right now, Grossi is not seen as an independent actor. He is seen as someone that is working for the American side on this issue, on the Israeli side, who refused to condemn some of these things. And the Iranians take note of the fact that Grossi announced his decision to run for Secretary General of the UN when he was in Washington. And from that, they read, rightly or wrongly, that he got the endorsement of the United States to run for Secretary General. The next Secretary General is going to be from Latin America. Grossi, of course, is Argentinian. And they believe that this is all part of that. I don't know if that's true or not, but perceptions, unfortunately, is what everyone is making their decisions on in a situation in which there is so little reliable information.
Continuing on that theme, on the question of perceptions of unreliability, on September the 9th, Israel attacked Doha in an attempt to assassinate the Hamas negotiating team while it was considering the latest US ceasefire proposal. This created an obvious parallel to the June attack on Iran. Iran was due to meet with the US for the 6th round of indirect talks, yet was attacked just 2 days before the talks were to resume in Oman. The Trump administration supported the June attacks. While there is greater ambiguity over the attacks on Doha, most observers believe that the US authorized the attack. In these circumstances, how can Iran be expected to negotiate in good faith with the US?
I think that's a very fair question, and a question that is asked in the entire region. You have a scenario in which the US side says that it found out about these attacks too late and couldn't do anything. The Israelis say that they actually notified Trump 7:45 in the morning, which was, I think, roughly an hour before, which meant that Trump could have stopped it and chose not to. Moreover, the United States has its largest base in the Middle East in Doha, which means that it is protected with the best air defense systems that exist. Air defense systems somehow was not activated when Doha was under attack by the Israelis. So someone must have decided not to activate those air defense systems because they detect that these planes are coming, et cetera, et cetera. So whether the United States knew about it, did not know about it, both of those scenarios are very, very bad. If the US knew about it, decided not to do something, or perhaps it was even complicit, it shows that the security umbrella that the Qataris and the GCC states believe that they have with the United States is not just ineffective vis-a-vis Iran. It's also ineffective against the United States itself because the US itself may have either allowed for or conspired in an attack on their soil. Their challenge, of course, is that they're in a terrible position. They don't have other options available to them right now. But what it does is the larger issue of the unreliability of the United States from the perspective now, in this specific case, of America's close friends. So then you can imagine how it is perceived by America's enemies, if even the friends don't believe that they can rely on the US as a result of this. I think this is one of the big dangers that the Trump administration in some of its conduct here has really inflicted on itself. When Trump comes out and he endorses the Israeli attacks and says that this was a remarkable act of deception that was done by the US and Israel together, well, right there, that is enough to really question why diplomacy is of any value going forward. It's not to say that the two sides needed to trust each other. Trust rarely exists in negotiations, but this level of mistrust in which essentially Trump is claiming that there was weeks, months of deception going on in order to lure the Iranians into a false sense of security through negotiations only to attack them. That already then is raising the bar for any future negotiations. Ultimately, this is disastrous for the United States itself. If friends and foes believe that it is an untrustworthy, unreliable partner, we are moving towards a multipolar world. The administration admits it, unlike the Biden administration, who denied it and accused anyone who talked about multipolarity of echoing Putin talking points, which was a ridiculous statement by that. But in a multipolar world, the United States is going to need to use diplomacy far more than it has done in the last 10, 15 years, precisely because the world is multipolar and the US doesn't have that level of relative power any longer.
Sorry, can I just quickly cut in there? Thank you. This is so informative, but I am very aware that we've only got a couple of minutes left. And Steve, there are some questions from the audience that I've sent over to you. So I don't know if you want to wrap up and maybe move on to those quickly because Trita has to leave.
Yeah. Um, do you think, Trita, that there's a greater chance that following the attack on Qatar, the Arab leaders will act collectively alongside Iran to stand up to US and or Israel?
So again, the GCC states don't have many options. I mean, take a look at Europe. Europe actually has a defense industry, all of these different things, and it still didn't move towards strategic autonomy, even on the great evidence that the United States was no longer willing to provide that level of a security umbrella for Europe. In the case of the GCC states, they have nothing. These are not countries that produce weapons or any, alternative that is readily available to them. The Iranians are going to try to use this as an argument to say, hey, the GCC should create some sort of a united front with Iran vis-a-vis Israel. The GCC is not going to go for that. The GCC may be hoping that the Turks will step in, but the Turks are likely not going to go for that because they don't want a confrontation with Israel. The US is going to tell them, if you just buy more weapons, we will make sure this doesn't happen again. It would be quite foolish for the GCC to fall for that. The GCC may be hoping that the Chinese will step in, but the Chinese are not dumb enough to step into this and provide security or provide those type of promises. So they're really left with very bad options if they want to operate in this paradigm. I think there's a different paradigm which would be much more valuable and perhaps even could provide a win-win-win, which is for all of these states to now move towards the establishment of an inclusive security architecture for the region. The fact that you had all of these countries together in the room is in and of itself quite unique. You had the Iranian president sitting there not too far away from Shara, the new president of Syria, who used to be with Al-Qaeda and who used to be fighting the Iranians just months ago. They're all in the same room. To build that type of an inclusive security architecture, and in my view, ultimately should also bring in the Israelis into it. In my view, the cost of the Israelis being able to be admitted is for a Palestinian state to be created as well. That's the entry fee for the Israelis to be part of this inclusive security architecture. That would be a critical step to move away from this bloc formation and balance of power only type of approach, in which, the region is constantly being organized by half of the region against the other half. And then you play musical chairs. The Qataris relied on the US to balance the Iranians, and now they may be relying on the Iranians to balance Israel. I mean, it's just an endless game that doesn't provide long-term security. An inclusive security architecture absolutely can, just as it did in Europe before the Europeans chose to, unfortunately, go in the wrong direction on that. This would also have a big win for the US, because the US says that he wants to leave the region. Trump, more than any other president, has said that he wants to bring US troops home from the region and wants to do burden shifting. Well, to do the burden shifting, you need to have something to shift the burden onto. And in the absence of that type of a security architecture, it's very difficult to do it. But if the US plays a helpful role, not a leading role, this needs to be led by the region itself. If it plays a helpful role to move in that direction, it can ultimately also actually be very positive for the US. But it takes a completely different mentality to think in these terms. This is a paradigm shift of security, one that I think the region absolutely needs, and perhaps precisely because Qatar and the GCC's options are so bad right now, they may actually muster the political will to think in these terms.
As far as civil society and the anti-war movement in the E3 countries and presumably in the US as well goes, obviously the possibility of pressing for a return or a maintenance of diplomatic solutions looks unfavorable, but is of course necessary. Are there any issues that you think that we should particularly focus on in the anti-war movement on concerning the E3 position?
I think it's so crucial that you all never give up and that you keep on pressing. It is so important. It is very sad to see that the foreign policies of the E3 are increasingly out of sync with the overwhelming wishes of the European polity. We see that very clearly on Gaza. And I think we're seeing it increasingly in Ukraine, not in the sense that the population is sympathetic to the Russians, but in the sense of This war needs to end, and we need to have a diplomatic solution. We cannot just have endless war there. This cannot sustain itself. There's going to be a backlash. We were here in the United States, and it ended up with anti-establishment figures coming to the fore. In the case of the Republicans, it was Trump. Him channeling the anti-war sentiments of the American population was a critical reason as to why he won the Republican nomination in the first place, and a critical reason as to, particularly up against Hillary Clinton, he had a leg up on when it comes to foreign policy, despite zero experience. I think it's very important to recognize that what Starmer and what many of these other governments are doing is simply not sustainable. It's going to change. The question is, will civil society be there in the right way to make sure that the change is a positive change? That it's not just a positive change on the surface and a lot of slogans, but in essence actually moves in an even more militaristic direction, which I think to a certain extent is what we have seen here in the United States.
Thank you. I'll hand back to Grace.
Thank you very much, Trita. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening, or today for you. We really appreciate it, and it was incredibly informative. So thank you very much, and thank you to you too, Steve, for leading on those questions. And thank you all so much for being here. If any of you are in London, please do join us tomorrow at the Stop Trump demonstration, starting at BBC Portland Place from 2 p.m. And then the rally will start from 5 p.m. at Parliament Square. So please do all you can to be there. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.